book we call the Holy Bible is still one of the most widely read and distributed pieces of literature in the English language. But what exactly is the Bible, and how should we understand its contents? I'm Pastor Chris White, and that's my assignment over the course of the series, What You Should Know About the Bible. In the last 4 installments, we've considered the question, what is the nature of the contents of the Bible? And what do we mean when we say the Bible is an inspired text? In this video, we'll build on these ideas by looking at the idea of canonicity. In theological terms, this answers a specific question: which books should be included in the Holy Bible as inspired texts? Further, it answers another question: why were some texts excluded? Because of the breadth of this topic, I'll be forced to limit the scope of our study, focusing less time on the Old Testament and more time on the New Testament. So when we talk about the canon of Scripture, we're making essentially a theological statement. We're saying that the library we call the Bible contains the only books inspired by God. How this came about and how this was determined for the Old Testament are what we will explore next. The Old Testament was essentially completed 400 years before Christ. Although Malachi appears last in the canon, which was organized by content rather than chronology, the very last book written was actually 2 Chronicles. In 198 BC, Israel was part of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Its capital was in Alexandria, Egypt, and so large numbers of Jews naturally migrated there until there was nearly as many there as was living in Palestine. As the Alexandrian Jewish community grew, it quickly became a center of theological study and intellectual life. This became the impetus for the Greek translation we know as the Septuagint. This translation contains the books we know as the Old Testament, which means the canon was actually already settled. Just an aside, some of the early Christian fathers only accepted the Septuagint and not the Hebrew Old Testament. They felt the Jews had corrupted the text to blot out any references to Christ. The reality is many of them were just angry at the Jews for stirring up trouble for Christians, since most of them couldn't even read Hebrew anyway. During this time, there was a famous essay called Baba Bathra, written by the elders of Israel, which lists all the books of the Old Testament and also the names of the authors. This is not the last word, but because of its antiquity, it is an important source for knowing who wrote certain books of the Old Testament, as many are not named. The recognition of the Old Testament was very universal. Jesus is an important authority in this regard. First, in Luke 24, he referred to the Old Testament as Moses and the prophets, which were standard categories for the Old Testament canon. He also only referred to canonical books in his teaching and never criticized the Jews for the Old Testament context, just their interpretations of it. Another important guide stone was the Council of Jamnia in Palestine, which met in AD 70. This group of religious leaders met to decide what they should do since the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. It was here that they decided adherence and study of the Old Testament would be a substitute for blood sacrifice until the day God saw fit to restore the temple. As part of their deliberations, they drew up an official list of their canon, and these were the books they said defile the hands, meaning they're so sacred, men must ritually wash their hands after touching the Scriptures. 20 years later, Josephus, in his letter against Appian, writes, "Although such long ages have gone by, no one has dared to add anything to them, to take anything away from them, or change anything in them." Although brief, this is truly the essence of the canon of the Old Testament. It was completed 400 years ago before Christ, and 200 years later, we see it fixed to a degree in Alexandria. By the time of Jesus and after, the Old Testament's recognition appears to be fully established in historic memory and in practical purpose. In our next video, we'll move from the topic of the Old Testament to the more complex story of the New Testament canon. I hope you'll come back. Until then, this is Chris White. Thanks for watching.